All right, welcome back, everyone. I have a interesting question this week. What do Gwynteth Paltrow, Dungeons and Dragons, and a shocking North Carolina murder case have in common? Any thoughts, Sean?
Off the top of my head, no.
Okay, well, this whole thing started in a really weird way and ended up in an even weirder place. So I'm going to get into today a story that started on the night of July 25th, 1988, in the quiet town of Washington, North Carolina, where a brutal murder shocked the community. Wealthy local businessman Lieth Von Stein was savagely attacked in his bed and left for dead. His wife, Bonnie Von Stein, was beaten but survived. The crime initially appeared to be a random home invasion, but as detectives dug deeper, they uncovered a chilling conspiracy involving Leith's own stepson, Christopher, his college friends, and a role-playing game called Dungeons and Dragons, a combination that would ignite even more controversy. That's what we're covering this week on How It All Went South. Lieth Peter Von Stein was a 42-year-old textiles executive living with his family in the Smallwood subdivision of Washington, North Carolina. He had married Bonnie Von Stein, and through that marriage became the stepfather of her two children from a previous relationship. There was Christopher "Chris" Pritchard and his younger sister, Angela. Now, Lieth was professionally successful. He worked as an executive at National Spinning, a local textile company, and he had accumulated substantial wealth, including a share of his family's prosperous Camel City dry cleaners business in Winston-Salem. Now, the stepson, Christopher Pritchard, was 19 in 1988, and he was a college student at NC State in Raleigh, North Carolina. Away from home for the first time, Christopher embraced a lifestyle of heavy partying, drugs, and fantasy role-playing. He bonded with two college friends, James Bartlett Bart Upchurch and Gerald Neil Henderson, both around the same age as Chris, over their shared love of the game Dungeons and Dragons and frequent drug use, which I don't recommend doing together.
Well, I was just thinking, you remember in the 80s, in the late 80s, there was a whole thing about Dungeons and Dragons and heavy metal. And if you were into those two things, you were a Satanist.
Yep.
I mean, it was, and you were going to commit murders. I mean, it was a big thing.
Yeah. This is the rabbit hole that I went down,
Right.
Not knowing that there was a D&D connection here, and remembering early 80s, how this became a narrative. I'm going to touch on a couple pop culture moments that really put that forward for sure. In the summer of 1988, greed and resentment took root in Christopher Pritchard's mind. Lieth Von Stein, a stepfather, had recently come into a sizable inheritance, and Chris realized that if something happened to his mother and stepfather, he stood to gain that fortune as their surviving heir. So that prospect proved irresistible. Chris began to plot a dark crime. He enlisted those two college friends, Upchurch and Henderson, in a plan to murder Lieth and Bonnie Von Stein, offering to share the expected inheritance money with them as a reward. So essentially, they agreed to kind of go in on this together, and they'd split the money once the stepfather of Chris was dead. That was the plan.
I want to say that this is, and because I have not heard the story, I don't think, but I want to say that there were several stories like this in the 80s, and that like traced back to Dungeons and Dragons. which I think is probably part of the reason that whole thing happened, right?
Yeah, and this gets even bigger than I realized.
Huh.
I just thought this was a story I uncovered and a little bit of a D&D connection. Remember, I still haven't brought up Gwynteth Paltrow yet, so.
That's right. I
Or
forgot
Ed
about that already.
Or Dennis Farina, or Ed Asner, or Gwyneth Paltrow's mom, Blythe Danner. There's a whole other thing that happens here. And even Tom Hanks has a stitch in this story, so stay tuned. So, yes, a significant inheritance from his parents where they had essentially doubled their net worth, making him, Lieth, a man of substantial means. A legal document from the court case later on revealed that Von Stein had a $700,000 life insurance policy and had set up a $600,000 trust for his stepchildren, Chris and Angela, which was to be distributed when Angela turned 35. But Chris, being in college, being on drugs, didn't want to wait. He could get that money sooner. So that's essentially what played out. So on the night of the murder, around 3 a.m., two masked intruders entered the Von Stein home. Lieth, the stepfather, was stabbed and bludgeoned repeatedly while sleeping in his bed. He was stabbed 12 times, I believe, and also hit with a baseball bat.
Jesus.
The mother, Bonnie Von Stein, was attacked as well, but she survived with very serious injuries. And their teenage daughter, Angela, escaped unharmed. In fact, she didn't even wake up while this was happening and called 911. So Lieth died from massive head trauma and multiple stab wounds, as you would imagine. The house showed no signs of forced entry, leading police to suspect someone inside the family circle. So they had their suspicions.
And they're looking around at like who's left. You have the mother who's already been attacked, the daughter who's freaking out and terrified, and then you have the son dressed in all black with like goth makeup. You know what I mean? Like they're going
swords and shit, you know?
Yeah, Dungeons and Dragons and like, I don't know, Slayer t-shirt, whatever.
Hey, I almost bought one of those Slayer t-shirts when I was in the woods. But so let me step back. Have you ever played Dungeons and Dragons, or was that ever a thing for you?
I think I tried to play one time when I was young, but it was so like the 20-sided die.
Right. That got too confusing for you?
It wasn't my thing.
It wasn't my thing either.
I remember like we played Magic the Gathering, that card game, for a bit when I was in I don't know, 14, 13, something like that. I was into that for a minute, but I started playing guitar, man, when I was like, seriously, and all that other stuff was like,
yeah, I got no problem with it. It's just not my thing. It's just not my thing. So let's talk about how the murder plot unfolded that night in July 1988. So in the early morning hours of July 25th, 1988, also my anniversary, that date or day, the plan set in motion by Chris Pritchard came to its gruesome fruition. Chris himself made sure to be away from the home that night, staying in his dorm room at NC State, thinking about an alibi, of course, right? So he sends Gerald Neil Henderson and James Bart Upchurch on a 108-mile journey from Raleigh to the Von Stein residence in Washington, North Carolina. And so the two approached the brick house in the subdivision in Washington, and they had the knife and a blunt club or bat. Chris had provided a floor plan of the house, so they knew where to go and how to get to his stepfather and mother quickly. And like I said, Lieth Von Stein was stabbed multiple times and bludgeoned with a club, suffering lethal wounds. But Bonnie survived the attack. So she regained consciousness after being beaten and was able to reach a telephone and summon aid by calling 911 at 4:27 in the morning. And I've heard the 911 call of I think my husband is dead, he's been stabbed, and I'm barely alive too. So she's definitely hanging on for dear life.
You should play some of that.
Yeah, totally will. Totally will. It's pretty chilling. When first responders arrived, they found a ghastly scene, 40-year-old Leith dead in his blood-soaked bed and 44-year-old Bonnie clinging to life. The couple's daughter, Angela Pritchard, was discovered unharmed in her upstairs bedroom. Astonishingly, the 17-year-old claimed to have slept through the entire ordeal and never heard the intruder enter or the violence that followed afterwards. So it's a little bit suspicious. They're a little bit like, this feels a little bit funny, but we've talked about this before where this sometimes happens.
Well, and the sister slept through it initially, right? So, how could you say?
Yeah. So investigators had a chilling possibility that it could have been someone within the family. And at first, they treated all three family members as persons of interest, including Bonnie herself, even though she was in critical condition from her wounds and seemed an unlikely suspect. Why would she do that, right? Including getting attacked.
Yeah.
Angela, the teenager, even though she slept through it, there was really no motive for her to be able to do this. Although, maybe she was in on this inheritance thing. So they started to look at Chris Pritchard, the 19-year-old, and, it took a little bit, but under mounting pressure in the investigation, Gerald Neil Henderson, one of the other guys, confessed to his role in the plot to authorities, and he spilled he spilled the whole story about what had happened and how it was really Chris Pritchard that had led them here, that they were going to split the money and all of those things. So they were taken into custody and charged in connection with the murder of Lieth Von Stein and the attempted murder of Bonnie Von Stein also. So that happens, and this is where that narrative starts to come in play, where they look at these guys, look at them being on drugs, and it becomes this thing. It's like the Dungeons and Dragons case. Like you talked about at the beginning of the episode, like the heavy metal or the D&D kids, like this was around the same time that there was a controversy around the moral panic, the satanic panic, the things happening in America. And this murder seemed to pour, fuel on the fire for that. So it became a thing.
Yeah, because that was also, there were, I think, Ozzy Osbourne, I think, was sued, or they tried to sue him, if I'm not mistaken, because, kids were committing crimes or killing themselves. And quoting lyrics. Metallica had the same thing. It was like a thing, and it all tied in with this group of kids and Dungeons and Dragons and all that stuff. It was really, really an odd time when you think about it.
Well, this is what they started to discover, that these guys the three of them, were avid D&D players during their college days, but it went a little bit further than just being a couple guys around a table rolling the multi-sided dice or die. Yes. They sometimes acted out Dungeons and Dragons scenarios in real life.
Of course they did.
Dressing up and wielding real knives or swords while roaming the steam tunnels under the NC State campus, often under the influence of drugs and alcohol. So it was becoming this melded fantasy of Dungeons and Dragons plus the drugs.
What a Saturday night that sounds like.
So the question for investigators is, did D&D somehow inspire or facilitate the murder plot, right? Was there a connection? And detectives did find a game manual among Chris Pritchard's belongings and noted eerie similarities between a violent scenario in the book and the actual murder plan. So
it's just like, you hear that stuff throughout history, and it could be the Dexter, I did a case on the Dexter killer, who was so obsessed and fascinated with that show that he tried to emulate it. It's like, you cannot put something out there into the world and then, especially something that's popular, has millions of viewers or users or whatever, you can't be the judge of or be responsible for the 0.01% of people who take it seriously or act on it in a crazy way. I just always think that's ridiculous,
Well, they weren't really well, I mean, so it comes up in trial. He talks about this fantasy world that he's in. Obviously, he's on drugs. And I think it really did get overplayed as a motivation here. I think obviously the motivation for the crime was I want to kill my parents and inherit money. The influence of D&D as another factor is, to me, secondary here, but it was definitely played up. And so this is where I did not expect this to go. Not necessarily in the story, but how this story lived on. And so I did not know this. There was 2 best-selling true crime books that were made based on this story. One is called Cruel Doubt by Joel McGinnis, and Jerry Bledsoe wrote Blood Games. They were both published in 1991, and they lean heavily into the D&D angle. And they were both adapted into TV miniseries. And they came out within like weeks of each other, these competing miniseries running on different networks about the same damn story.
Right.
So
some things never change.
Right.
Because you see that all the time today. I mean, the Murdoch case.
That's right. So Cruel Doubt was the miniseries that starred a young Gwynteth Paltrow as the sister Angela. And her mother, real life mother, plays her mother in the movie. She's Bonnie, Blythe Danner. And it's a whole cast of, you remember these miniseries from the 80s and 90s of like cast of characters, big dramatic, I think it was a couple night miniseries.
Yeah.
And it was a big deal. And I watched it. The whole thing is on YouTube. If you want to check it out, we'll play a couple clips here. But there's young Gwynteth as Angela. So strange.
Probably will pass on that. I'll wait for the inevitable remake.
Okay. And so there's a couple other pop culture things that I hinted to at the beginning of the episode around Dungeons and Dragons and television or movies. Do you remember the TV movie, and maybe before your time, it was called Mazes and Monsters. It came out in 1982.
I mean, I remember it. I didn't watch it because I was so, obviously I was a baby, but I know of it. Yeah.
Tom Hanks is the star.
Yeah.
It's a really, really good movie for a TV movie. He's exceptional in it, and it's about the influence of role-playing games. I don't think they say Dungeons and Dragons. The name of the game is Mazes and Monsters. And he, at the end, gets kind of so emotional and almost, let's just say, suicidal. They have a scene of him at the top of the World Trade Center, and his friends have to talk him down and do all this stuff. It's pretty wild. I was watching it yesterday too. So we'll play a clip from that too. I remember that movie. Like it's a pretty classic one. And then, so that's 1982. Just a year later, the Dungeons and Dragons animated series was on Saturday morning cartoons. Do you remember that?
Yeah, but again, I didn't watch it. I do remember that. And by the way, Saturday morning cartoons were the best.
The best.
Not to get off on a tangent here, but for those of us who grew up in the time of Saturday morning cartoons, because now you have 24-hour cartoons, you can go on to Netflix,
right.
You can go to whatever,
right?
Watch cartoons anytime. Like it was such a special thing.
I would wake up early just at
6 o'clock in the morning, man.
Scooby-Doo, 7 o'clock, whatever it was. And they used to have, it was just like they would roll out the schedule of what the cartoons were going to be for Saturday morning. They'd have a special just on that. It was so great. It was so. I'm with you.
I digress, but I miss those days.
And actually, so Dungeons and Dragons, the animated series, ran from 83 to 85, and it was really great. And it wasn't dark. It was fun. It was a cartoon, right? It wasn't. I mean, they had dark moments, but it had a great kind of through line or kind of following these kids through this alternate world. And it didn't have that darkness. So I think they turned the page on what D&D was from what I talked about to this. So anyway, James, so what are the outcomes here? So James Upchurch was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death, later commuted to life in prison. Chris Pritchard, the stepson, pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and conspiracy. Remember, he wasn't there that night. He let his buddies do it. He was sentenced to prison. was later reduced to 20 years after appeals, and he was released in 2007. I just watched a clip that I'll share a little bit about of him. He's, I think he's born again Christian and trying to lecture. I mean, he absolutely admits to the desire to kill his parents, to get the inheritance, to not have to work that hard, to, just like to be able to take drugs and not do anything. He truly admits to it, and he's preaching that, a positive note now.
I just never, and maybe, I didn't grow up in a family where we had, millions and millions of dollars. So it's hard to put yourself in that place. But I grew up with kids whose families were rich, you know what I mean? And with, some of them obviously. And I can't ever imagine, you hear these stories. I just cannot imagine putting a price, an amount of money on your family. Especially, I mean, anybody, but your family. It's just crazy to me that someone can go through all the stages of like thinking about this from this little explosion of an idea that should pass in a split second to like formulating a plan and getting other people involved and carrying it out and lying about it. All these things that's just such a foreign concept, man.
Yeah, let me leave you with this, which is Lieth Von Stein. I mean, Chris was not his natural son. It was his stepson. So he had to go out of his way to include him in the inheritance.
Sure.
I don't know how they got along. Maybe things weren't great. I'm sure they weren't. But the fact that he went out of his way to make sure that he would receive that inheritance upon his death, and Christopher, the college student, still goes ahead and says, I want it now. I don't want to do anything with my life. I want to work. I don't want to work. I want to just live in this fantasy world, and I'm going to have my parents murdered. The fact that he did that, I think it makes it even worse because of the fact that what his stepfather had done,
Yeah, he could have just said, well, that's not my kid. So
yeah, that was the, didn't have this on my bingo card, Gwynteth Paltrow, Dungeons and Dragons, and this crazy Washington, North Carolina murder. But that's what I have this week, Sean.
Yeah, I wasn't expecting to talk as much about Dungeons and Dragons and Saturday morning cartoons from the 80s as we did, but hey, that's what happens.
All right, sounds good. Thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll see you next time on How It All Went South.
See you guys.